This is a worm, and this is the most terrifying worm in the entire ocean. It's called the Bobbit worm, and while you might think it looks like a made-up creature from SpongeBob, it's actually real. And yes, it could actually bite you. But why do these worms actually exist, assuming it's not just to make the ocean seem even more terrifying? And what is the world's freakiest worm actually capable of? When most people think of worms, they think of the sad, pink earthworms you find on your driveway after it rains. They're slow, they're blind, and their entire existence on the food chain is basically just to serve as free bait for birds or fish. You put a worm on a hook to catch a fish because fish eat worms. That's just how the food chain works. But for this marine bristle worm, the fish is the bait. And the main reason it can do this is simply because of its sheer size. A fully grown bobbit worm can reach up to 10 feet long. That's longer than a surfboard, and about the thickness of a garden hose, covered completely in sharp, iridescent bristles. But the scariest part about this animal is that you'll never, ever see all 10 feet of it. Bobbit worms spend their entire lives buried vertically in the ocean floor. They dig a massive tunnel straight down into the mud, and they leave their entire body hidden inside of it. The only thing that actually ever touches the surface is the very top of their head, which is usually only about 2 inches wide. So if you're a fish swimming by, you don't actually ever see a 10-foot monster worm. You just see a colourful little bump in the sand. But if this worm is completely buried in the dark and only leaves 2 inches of its head exposed, how do you actually catch anything? The bobbit worm doesn't actually have eyes. At least, not eyes that can form an image or track a swimming fish. It's completely blind to the world around it. But it doesn't need to see you, because it has 5 highly sensitive antennae sticking right out of its head, resting just barely above the sand. These act like tripwires. The worm just sits there, completely motionless, and waits. When a fish swims down to the seabed to rest, it might accidentally brush its fin against one of those antennae. And the absolute millisecond that happens, the trap is triggered. The bobbit worm lunges out of the sand with explosive speed. And to do this, it uses a mechanism called pharynx aversion, which basically means it turns its own throat inside out and shoots its jaw forward. Which is exactly as horrifying as it sounds. These jaws look like, well, this. So they swing open wider than the worm's actual head. When they clamp down, they snap shut with so much force that the worm frequently slices its prey completely in half by accident. It strikes with so much raw kinetic energy that a smaller fish will literally just be severed on impact. Oops. But obviously, not every fish gets sliced in half. Sometimes the worm grabs a fish that's fully intact, and that actually creates a problem for the worm. If you're a 10-foot worm buried in the sand and you just clamped your jaws onto a fish that's still very much alive, you're now in a tug-of-war. The fish is going to panic. It's going to thrash, kick its tail, and try to swim straight up towards the surface. And because they're underwater, a strong enough fish could actually just swim up hard enough to literally rip the bobbit worm right out of its hole. If the worm gets pulled out of the sand, the hunt is over, and the worm is now completely exposed in the open ocean. So to stop this from happening, the bobbit worm uses something a lot worse than just grip strength. It relies on venom. Yes, I know. This worm already looks terrifying enough, and now it's also venomous. Cool. The exact moment the jaws pierce the fish's scales, the worms inject a paralyzing toxin directly into the fish's bloodstream. This toxin basically just turns the fish off. The fish doesn't even get the chance to thrash or swim away because within seconds, it completely loses the ability to lose its muscles. The bobbit worm needs the fish to be paralyzed because the next step of the hunt is to drag the prey alive straight down into the vertical tunnel under the sand to be digested. And obviously, pulling a paralyzed fish down a narrow tube is significantly easier than pulling one that's actively fighting back. So, with an ambush this effective, you'd naturally assume this thing is highly intelligent. But the bobbit worm is actually the exact opposite of intelligent. In fact, it literally doesn't have a brain. Instead of a centralized brain like a fish or a mammal, the bobbit worm operates on a nerve ganglion. It's basically just a bunch of nerve cords that run down its body, designed entirely for basic reflexes. The worm isn't strategizing or deciding if it's hungry. It doesn't even know what a fish is. It operates entirely as a hair trigger reflex. The antennae are wired directly to the jaw muscles. If the antenna is stimulated by physical pressure, the jaw fires. That's the entire thought process. It's a completely automatic reaction. If a fish touches it, it snaps. If a crab touches it, it snaps. If a piece of floating seaweed drifts by and bumps the antenna, the worm will violently attack the seaweed and drag it under the dirt. It's not sitting there going, "Ah, yes, a delicious snapper." It has absolutely zero concept of what it's actually grabbing until the object is already halfway down its throat. So, if the worm is completely brainless and operates purely on a hair trigger reflex that attacks literally anything that touches it, what happens if you touch it? Let's say you're snorkeling in a shallow reef. You get tired of swimming, so you decide to put your feet down and stand on the sandy bottom for a second to adjust your mark. If you happen to step your foot directly onto a buried bobbit worm, it's just going to feel the pressure on its antennae and the trap is going to fire. Now, obviously, a 2-inch jaw isn't going to drag a 150-pound human under the sand. You're completely safe from being eaten, which is good news. But being too big to eat doesn't somehow make you immune to getting stabbed. The worm's jaws are sharp enough to slice through a fish's scales, which means they're easily sharp enough to slice straight through the neoprene wetsuit and deep into your foot. And honestly, the cut itself is the least of your worries. The real problem is the venom. When the jaws lock into your skin, that paralyzing toxin is going straight into your bloodstream. For a fish, this means instant paralysis. For a human, the dosage isn't high enough to stop your heart or paralyze your entire body, but it will destroy your nerve endings. People who have accidentally been bitten by bobbit worms report radiating pain, swelling, and in some cases, long-term numbness in the area where they were bitten, because the toxin literally kills the nerves around the wound. But realistically, the odds of you stepping on a bobbit worm in the open ocean are pretty low. You're actually significantly more likely to encounter one of these monsters inside your own living room. If you want to set up a high-end saltwater aquarium, you're going to need something called live rock. Live rock is an actual porous rock taken directly from the ocean floor. Aquarium owners buy it because it's full of beneficial bacteria, tiny sponges, and microorganisms that keep the water chemistry perfectly balanced for exotic fish. But because this rock comes straight from the seabed, it has thousands of tiny cracks and crevices inside of it. And sometimes, a larval bobbit worm, which is only about 1 millimeter long, is hiding deep inside one of these cracks. The aquarium owner buys the rock, puts it in their tank, and completely forgets about it. Years go by. The worm stays hidden inside the rock or buries itself under the gravel. Because there are no predators in the tank, it just sits there and grows. And grows. Eventually, the owner starts noticing that their expensive saltwater fish are just disappearing. There are no dead bodies floating at the top. There are no fish jumping out the tank. The fish are just gone. Usually, the owner assumes it's a water disease, or that the fish are eating each other. They're basically just looking at the tank and going, "Where did my $200 clownfish go?" But eventually, they'll take a flashlight, walk up to the tank at 3 AM and look inside. And they'll see a massive iridescent worm stretched out across their pristine white gravel, actively hunting their pets. This worm has been living in the tank for years, slowly picking off the fish one by one. And because it only comes out in the pitch black, the owner never even knew it was there. If hiding in the ground is such a flawless strategy that it even works inside a glass box inside someone's living room, it brings up a really obvious question. If the ocean floor is literally littered with invisible traps that will drag you into the dirt, why do the fish even go down there? Why don't they just swim 10 feet higher up in the water column and avoid the ground entirely? Well, because the ocean is basically stacked, and small fish are at the absolute bottom. If you swim higher up into the open water, you're now in the pelagic zone. This is where the actual apex predators live. Sharks, barracudas, and tuna patrol the open water constantly. They have incredible eyesight, they swim incredibly fast, and they're actively looking for small fish that are dumb enough to leave the safety of the rocks. So the small fish are basically trapped. If they swim up, they get eaten by a shark. If they go down to hide from the shark, they get dragged under the dirt by a worm. Death from above or death from below. They literally have no choice but to risk the floor, because the floor is where their food is, and it's the only place they can actually hide from the predators above. The bobbit worm doesn't have to chase them, because it knows the fish will inevitably be forced to come down to the sand. But some of these fish actually figured out how to ruin the worm's entire strategy. Enter the Peter monocle bream. This is a normal-looking reef fish, but it figured out exactly how to deal with bobbit worms. When one of these fish is swimming near the sand and happens to spot the tiny antennae of a bobbit worm sticking out, they don't swim away. They stop, hover directly above the worm, and start calling for backup. Other bream will swim over and form a group, hovering in a circle right over the worm's hiding spot. Then they do something called mobbing. The fish will angle their bodies downward and rapidly shoot sharp jets of water out of their mouths directly at the sand covering the worm. They're basically using the water pressure to excavate the dirt. The jet blows away the camouflage, completely exposing the worm's head and the entrance to its tunnel. And if you couldn't tell, this is incredibly humiliating for the worm. And once the worm is exposed, the hunt is entirely ruined. The bobbit worm's trap only works if you don't know it's there. If the fish can see exactly where the jaws are, they'll never accidentally bump into the antennae. The worm is forced to retreat deep into its hole and basically just wait for the fish to get bored and leave. But why does the worm just take the abuse? If it has jaws that can slice a fish in half, why doesn't it just lunge completely out of the sand and kill the fish that are spitting water at it? The reason the bobbit worm never actually leaves its hole is because the moment it's fully exposed, it's basically a free meal. The head of the worm is heavily armored and extremely dangerous, but the rest of its 10-foot body is completely soft. Unlike a crab or a fish, it doesn't have a hard exoskeleton or thick scales. It's basically just 10 feet of soft tissue. If the worm were to pull its entire body out of the sand and try to chase a fish, it would be instantly targeted by every single predator in the area. A stingray or a large triggerfish would just swim down, bite the worm right in the middle of its soft body, and eat it. The worm is also incredibly slow when it isn't anchored inside its tunnel. It can't swim through open water effectively, and it can't crawl fast enough to outrun a fish. The sand is its only defense. The tunnel acts as a physical armor for the 99% of its body that's soft. It only exposes the 1% that's dangerous. So if a fish or a bigger predator actually manages to bite the worm's head and starts physically pulling it out of the sand, is the worm just dead? If a large predator, like a bottom-feeding shark or a massive ray, manages to grab a bobbit worm and tries to pull it out of its burrow, the worm immediately does something called autotomy. The worm will intentionally flex its muscles so hard that it literally snaps its own body in half, which seems like a bit of an overreaction. But it works. The predator gets to pull away a thrashing chunk of the worm's tail, and it gets a free meal. But the front half of the worm, the part with the head, the jaws, and the nerve center, instantly retreats deep into the safety of its tunnel. And because it's a worm, losing half of its body doesn't actually kill it. The head just sits down there in the dark, digests whatever food it already has, and slowly regenerates the missing segments of its tail over the next few months. It's an overpowered survival tactic. Even if you manage to spot the trap, and even if you manage to grab the worm, it just leaves you with a piece of its tail and vanishes back into the earth, which easily makes the bobbit worm one of the most successful predators on the ocean floor. But what if this thing was actually big? If you took the exact anatomy and hunting style of a bobbit worm and scaled it up to the size of a large snake or a movie monster, the ocean would basically be unswimmable. At that size, they'd be hunting dolphins, seals, and small whales. Imagine a 50-foot long predator buried vertically in the seafloor, with jaws the size of car doors. It would just sit in the coastal shallows, completely invisible. A seal would swim down to catch a fish, brush against an antenna, and instantly get snapped in half by a force it couldn't even see coming. The only reason this doesn't exist is because of the physical limits of oxygen in the ocean. Worms absorb the oxygen directly through their skin and external gills. If a worm gets too thick, the oxygen literally can't reach their insides, and they'd just suffocate. So, physics strictly prevents worms from reaching the size of great white sharks. We're saved entirely by the square cube law. Shout out to physics. But even at their current size, are they really the worst thing hiding in the sand? The ocean floor is actually full of animals that use the sand as a weapon. You have the stargazer fish, which buries itself with just its eyes pointing up. But a stargazer just opens its mouth and swallows you whole. It's over in a second. At least they have the decency to make it quick. You have the cone snail, which hides in the sand and shoots a venomous harpoon. But the cone snail just stings you and waits for you to die before eating you. But the bobbit worm is worse than all of them, simply because of how it actually hunts. It grabs you, paralyzes your muscles so you can't fight back, and then physically drags you alive beneath the dirt. You're pulled out of the water column and straight down into a suffocating tunnel to be slowly digested. And because this strategy is so lethal, you'd expect that over millions of years, fish would have evolved a permanent counter to it. You'd think the ocean would have adapted to make the bobbit worm obsolete, but it hasn't, and neither has the worm. If you look at the fossil record, researchers have found ancient burrows and jaw fragments from predatory bristle worms dating back hundreds of millions of years, all the way to the Paleozoic era. And the terrifying truth is that they look almost exactly the same as bobbit worms alive today. Evolution is usually a constant arms race. A predator gets faster, so the prey gets better armor. The prey gets better armor, so the predator gets sharper teeth. Animals are constantly forced to change, upgrade, or go extinct. But the bobbit worm just opted out of the arms race. Nature doesn't fix things that aren't broken, and sitting completely invisible in the dirt, waiting for your food to literally touch your mouth, is a strategy that simply doesn't fail. The worm doesn't need to swim faster because it doesn't swim. It doesn't need better eyesight because it hunts by touch. It figured out a flawless hunting strategy millions of years ago, and it simply hasn't needed to change a single thing since. When we think about being scared of the ocean, we almost always look out to the blue water. We look for the silhouette of a shark fin, or we worry about what might be swimming up behind us in the dark. We're basically just trained to fear the open water. But if a shark is coming for you, you can at least see it. Sometimes. But the bobbit worm kinda shows that the seabed isn't really a flaw at all, but genuinely a roof. And underneath that roof are millions of brainless traps just sitting in the dark waiting for something to land. Realistically though, they're mostly found in tropical Indo-Pacific marine environments, not your typical swimming beach. I'm not just trying to make you fear having a good time on vacation. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed, and thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel. I really appreciate all the comments you guys are leaving. It really helps me keep going and try to continue making good content for you guys. And if you want to see our video about the first worms ever, check it out here.